Hello, this week we will be covering Chapter 5 and we'll take a little bit of a look into socialization. Now, to really think about the extent to which socialization affects each of us, a good way to start thinking about that is to review kind of these rare instances in which individuals are not socialized. So here on slide 2, I have a link to a video. It's about an hour-long documentary. It is a little lengthy, but I'd like for y'all to at least watch the first 15 minutes of it. It's called Wild Child, the Story of Feral Children. And this video, it takes a look at feral children, or children who are not adequately socialized, and asks the question, what happens to a child who has been abandoned or left in the wild from a young age? What happens to a child that's locked up or confined from a young age and isn't able to interact with their family members or other human beings? So when we look at feral children and think about socialization, of course, questions about nature versus nurture come up. So are we a product of our genes or of our socialization? Are we completely quote-unquote human if we're not raised by other humans? So this video looks at several different cases of feral children throughout history, around the world. Doesn't happen very often, but there are rare instances where children have been neglected or abandoned by their parents, and in one case is raised outside by a local tribe of dogs who feeds her, and she lives with them for several years during her early childhood. So this video, and thinking about feral children, it hopefully will demonstrate to you kind of this importance of socialization for developing language, empathy, and even our identity as individuals. So what is socialization? Socialization is the process through which people are taught to be capable members of a society. So this includes the ways that people come to understand societal norms and expectations, to accept society's belief structures, and to be aware of the societal values, so the difference between right and wrong according to your society. So even the most basic of human activities are learned, even if they seem so natural to us by the time we're young adults. And in particular, on this slide, I have a video that focuses on one case of a feral child. Her name was Oksana Malaya. If you watched the entire video on the last slide, you've already kind of seen her story, but if you just want to watch a shorter video that focuses just on her and her case and her recovery, you can go ahead and watch this one here. So Oksana Malaya, she was a Russian little girl, and when she was still an infant, her parents, who were alcoholics, left her outside one night and I guess forgot that she was under their care. And a group of local dogs, in fact, kind of adopted Oksana, and the documentary here states that the dogs breastfed her, and over the years she lived with them for a number of years during her formative early childhood, and the dogs took care of her. She hunted with them. She kind of learned to crawl on all fours the way that dogs do. Since she was not raised by humans, she never really was socialized to walk on two legs. So even when they found her when she was about 8 years old, she still kind of transported herself by crawling around on all fours. Again, her case kind of demonstrates how important socialization from other humans is for our formation, our brain formation, and our socialization. As Oksana really had no concept of language, and her communication was usually in barks, as she learned from, the dogs that took care of her and raised her. So her story shows how much we depend really on social interaction to provide the skills and information we need to become part of society and to develop a sense of self. Now, over the next few slides, we're going to look at 3 different sociologists and their different sociological theories of self-development. So we're going to look at George Herbert Mead, then Lawrence Kohlberg, and then Carol Gilligan. So George Herbert Mead was a sociologist, and he was writing back in the 1930s and 40s. And in 1934, he published Mind, Self, and Society from the standpoint of a social behaviorist. So he studied children at young ages and was interested in how people are socialized to develop an identity. So George Herbert Mead, he studied the self, a person's unique identity that's developed through social interaction. So he's definitely arguing on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. He is saying that our identity, everything we know about ourselves, it's constructed through a process of stages of socialization. So he believed people learn to be able to view themselves through the eyes of others, which he called, quote, the generalized other. And he said there is a concept of having a self, and becoming self-aware is not something we are born with. It's a learned behavior through which we begin to view ourselves through the eyes of the other. So George Herbert Mead developed 3 stages in the path of social development. First is the preparatory stage. This is when kids are fairly little, maybe 0 to 2 years old. And during this stage, children are mostly just capable of imitation. They don't yet have the ability to imagine how others see things. So at this stage, you're probably an infant. You interact with your mother and your father and your grandparents. And this is when you start imitating their behavior. Maybe just saying something back to them that they said to you, or if your grandpa scratches his nose, maybe the baby also, reaches up and learns how to scratch their nose. So from that preparatory stage of really infancy and very early childhood, we move into the play stage. And this is when children start to take on the role that another person might have. They start to imagine different roles in society and how they can play those roles out. So the child may start taking on the parent's point of view. If the mom is always complaining that the house is dirty, maybe the child will start saying, "This house is so dirty," or acting out grown-up behavior. So this is when children start to play dress up, play make-believe, but it's usually just about one specific role. So I'm playing doctor today, or I'm playing teacher, etc. Then we move on from the play stage to the game stage, and this is a little later on in childhood. And so this is when children start to consider multiple roles that are interacting at the same time and how those different roles interact with each other. And so this is the point where children develop, understand, and take on the role of that quote-unquote generalized other. So their thinking starts to be a little bit more abstract, and they can also see the interconnection of different roles rather than just playing one role at a time. So this is the stage where children start to develop that ability to understand a complex set of role relationships. For example, the child might go to a restaurant and start to understand that division of labor in the restaurant and all the different roles therein. So the child would start to understand that person is the server, that person is the cook, this person is the host, this person is the manager, and start to understand all those different roles and their responsibilities and expectations, and also how they interact, and if there's a hierarchy in terms of the roles, they start to recognize that as well. Another example would be children start to understand, like sports and the different roles within sports better at this age. So you move on from, t-ball to actually understanding a baseball game, and to understand how the different positions in the game interact and what role they play. So children start recognizing roles in organized groups and can anticipate the responses of others at this stage. Now, in the 1980s, the sociologist Lawrence Kohlberg kind of wanted to develop Mead's stages of social development a bit more, and Kohlberg focused specifically on the stages of moral development. And he stated that moral development is crucial in the socialization process. It's important in a smoothly functioning society that people know and learn the difference between good and bad and right and wrong according to that society. So he also came up with 3 different stages here. So there's pre-conventional, and this is when you're quite young, and this is when children are mostly interested in their self-interest. What's in it for me? So if the parent asks them to pick up the trash or the dirty clothes on their floor, they want to know, well, what's in it for me? What will I get for doing this task? So maybe they get a quarter or $1 or a piece of candy or a sticker on a chore chart. And so this is where they learn about self-interest and obedience to rules in order to avoid punishment. So from pre-conventional, you move to the conventional stage, and this is during adolescence or later childhood years. And this is where we learn to become aware of other people's feelings, not just our own, and take other people into consideration when we're taking an action. So it's no longer about just what's in it for me, it's also how will this affect other people. So learning the importance of meeting societal expectations and doing one's duty. So to be a good student or to be a well-behaved child becomes kind of an end in itself. You no longer need, a sticker or a quarter to do every little chore. You want to be a good kid for your mom so she'll be proud of you, or you want to get an A so that your teacher will be proud of you and you'll be deemed a good student. So we start having a greater respect for authority during the conventional stage. And from that stage, we move into our teenage years, which Kohlberg labeled the post-conventional stage. And this is where we move beyond just thinking about, well, how will my actions affect people that I know? How will it affect my mom? How will it affect my teacher? We move beyond that and start to think of morality in more abstract terms. So start understanding that in our society, there's a belief that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not just your teacher, not just your mom, not just you, everyone in the society. So things start getting a little more broad in terms of your moral development, and we start to see the world through other people's eyes, even if we don't know them personally. So this is where people begin to recognize that legality and morality do not always match up, start to think about things like justice and right and wrong in a little bit of a more nuanced manner. And this is where individuals start to realize that in order to do something right, you might have to break the rules sometimes. So for instance, if you ever heard that kind of moral quandary about story about a father, and he's recently been laid off from his job, his child is incredibly sick, they can't afford the medicine to help the child, he's in a lot of pain, and the father goes breaks into a pharmacy and steals the medication that his child needs to make the child feel better. Obviously, that's an illegal act that is against kind of the standards of right and wrong that are set forth by society. You don't steal. But at the same time, you can analyze that situation and as a parent, imagine yourself as a parent and the lengths that you might go to help or save your child, and how you kind of weigh those different moral factors, what's illegal and wrong in terms of the law, but performing that illegal act will help your child, and in another sense, morality would dictate that you should do anything to help your child. So it's a bit of a moral quandary, and it's an example of how we start to think of morality in more abstract terms. There's not always black and white, right and wrong. It becomes more of a kind of a nuanced debate within ourselves about which standards of right and wrong we feel most inclined toward, determined by a certain situation. Now, Carol Gilligan in 1982 wrote a book called In a Different Voice, and she pretty explicitly is criticizing Lawrence Kohlberg's development of those moral stages of development. In particular, she criticizes Kohlberg for only studying men or boys within his studies, and she pointed out that men and women are socialized differently in a number of different ways, and that she believed that women were raised and men were raised with a different kind of orientation toward what is right and wrong and how to make decisions based on morality. So she was critical of theories of moral development like Kohlberg's because they accentuated the idea that men only thought in terms of the abstract and were unemotional and logical, and she felt these kinds of theories were unfair to both men and women because they didn't accurately represent the human experience of both genders. So Kohlberg, again, in his last stage of moral development, talks about how people learn to think in the abstract about what is right and wrong. But Gilligan said that women are actually socialized to make moral decisions based on relationships and this kind of ethos of care for other people, and not just in this abstract sense that is devoid of kind of relationships to others. So there's a little video interview with Carol Gilligan on this page, pretty short. Hope you give it a look. She just explains the development of her thought process when she started doing this research. So in order to get a more kind of balanced perspective between the different gendered socialization of morality, Carol Gilligan studied both boys and girls when she was looking at moral development, and wanted to look for the differences between how boys and girls develop morally and come to have different understandings of morality once they reach kind of those late teenage years. So in particular, she found that boys, throughout her observation and her interviews, she found that boys have a more justice-oriented perspective with an emphasis on kind of what we'll come to talk about later, formal norms. So emphasis on laws, rules, and punishments. And she claimed this was a socialization for the work environment. Because when you go to work, there's usually a lot of formal norms you need to abide by, kind of these bureaucratic rule books. And she said that boys were being socialized for this kind of environment, maybe even subconsciously by people, their teachers, their parents. Then, on the other side of the coin, she found that girls have a perspective oriented around care, personal connection, and responsibility. And that little girls gave a lot more consideration to people's reasons behind their behavior that seem morally wrong. So, using the example of that father that went to steal the medication for his sick child that he couldn't afford. She found that girls would be more likely to ask, well, why did he steal the medication, rather than just saying that man should go to jail. They asked more questions and tried to understand the kind of rationale behind the seemingly wrong behavior. And Gilligan claimed that this was a kind of socialization for the home environment, to be a mother and a caretaker. So she was interested in kind of particularly the moral socialization of women to be emotional and selfless and always caring for others and kind of neglecting themselves and what's right for them in the process as well. She said that women would always frame their moral decisions based on their relationships with others rather than about what was good or bad for them. And Gilligan, importantly, claims that neither of these perspectives, the justice-oriented perspective or the care perspective, neither one is better or worse than the other, and that actually both of these perspectives need to be balanced in both genders in order to have the best functioning society. So she argued that it was unfair kind of to little girls to be socialized only around this care perspective, but it was also unfair for little boys to be socialized with this justice-oriented perspective because, again, little boys are taught, not to be emotional, don't cry, keep your feelings to yourself. And little girls, on the other hand, are more socialized to cry, to show their emotions, to be sensitive, to be caring. So Gilligan thought that there should actually be a balance between these two for both genders, and that would bring about a better social order. And she argued that integrating both of these moral perspectives, both the masculine justice-oriented and the feminine care-oriented perspective, is the best way to recognize our potential as social human beings. For the next few slides, we're going to take a look at different agents of socialization. And we will start with social group agents and move on to institutional agents of socialization on the next slide. So our two social group agents are family and peer groups. So these are these social group agents of socialization that start to have an impact on us in very early time in our age. So family is the first agent of socialization. Obviously, you're born, they take you home, and the first people that you are around with on a daily basis are your mother, your father, your siblings, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. And our family shows us how to relate to others and how the world works. They talk to us, they show us the proper way to eat in our society, the proper way to use the restroom, and they teach us an unending array of social ideas, teach us about objects in the household and objects that we'll encounter later in life, and the proper behaviors in specific situations. So children are also taught to abide by gender norms, perceptions of race and class-related behaviors from very early age. Now from family, the second major socialization experience outside the realm of the family is your peer group. So children start attending school at different ages. Some start preschool, some start kindergarten, but at a certain point we start socializing and becoming familiar with other individuals in our age group, and are usually similar in our social status. And eventually, when we start getting old enough to make friends, we usually choose friends who share our interests. So peer groups help people develop their sense of identity because they start to kind of define themselves separate from their family. Who do they want to be to other people in their age bracket? So they start to develop an identity separate from their parents and start to exert independence. Now we will look at a few different institutional agents of socialization on the next several slides. So we'll start with school, which is also usually one of the first places that we come in contact with the peer group agents. So school in itself, though, is its own agent of socialization, and this happens on a number of different levels. Yes, we're all aware that school, its primary function is to teach us, our subjects, our math and reading, history, civics, science, art, music, sports, etc. But there's also a term referred to as the quote-unquote hidden curriculum of school. And this is kind of that latent, meaning kind of this underlying secondary function of school. And that's to socialize children into certain behaviors that will set them up to succeed in life later on. So these quote-unquote lessons of the hidden curriculum, they don't necessarily have to be explicitly stated or written out in a textbook for students to learn them. They're learned via the teacher's tone of voice, the artwork in the classroom, and other passively communicated cues. So we'll go over a few examples of what the hidden curriculum refers to on the next slide. So on this slide, there's several examples of the hidden curriculum. So we'll go through these one by one. Number one, textbook material. So we can look at textbooks and realize that there are instances of exclusion and inclusion of certain lessons that can systematically alter the way students perceive history. So it's not only about what's in the textbook, it's also about maybe what was glossed over or omitted completely from certain history lessons. So for instance, there are some textbooks that gloss over the brutal aspects of early American colonialism, don't really refer to kind of the brutality of the Trail of Tears in the Native Americans or the brutality of slavery in America. Another example is when you take place in group projects or team games at recess. And this is where, even though it's not written out in a textbook of curricula for us, we start to learn how to work as a team with other people who might not even be our friends, but we know that we have to work with them to succeed on either a project in class or to win a game in recess. And we also learn collaboration at this point. Another example of hidden curriculum is like your daily schedule of classes and the fact that the school bell rings at a certain hour in order to indicate the end of one period and the beginning of your next period. And the schedule and the school bell ringing at definitive times every day kind of teaches us a sense of personal responsibility, that you need to be where you need to be on time. And this kind of lesson prepares us, for the work world. You need to be on time to your classes, and that trains us to be on time and be responsible workers once we enter the workforce. Another example is kind of the practice of raising your hand to speak in class, or learning not to fidget, to sit still. And the lesson here is to understand rules of order, taking your turn, waiting to be called on, and also rules of hierarchy. So respecting the teacher and their rules and the order of the classroom, and knowing that the teacher is in a position of more respect than the students, and that you need to wait on the teacher to call on you in order to speak. Another example would be just the standard practice of receiving grades, or sporting events where you get awards or student awards. So usually schools maybe once, twice a year have an assembly, and they give out awards according to excellent performance in school or volunteering or in the particular sport that they are good at. And these kinds of award ceremonies, kind of that latent purpose for them is to develop a competitive drive, because if you see another student getting an award for their great grades, it should, develop a competitive drive in you that you want to be the one on that stage the next time that assembly is held. You want to be the winner. Then another example would be standardized tests. Kind of this uniformity of expectations. Everyone has to take this test and earn a certain score on it in order for you to maybe move to the next grade or get into college, the SATs. And that kind of uniformity of expectations, again, it prepares us for both our role as a citizen, because as a citizen, under kind of the bureaucratic practices of Western law, all of the citizens are held to the same expectations, the same laws. So that prepares us to be a citizen. It also prepares us to go into the workforce where, again, there's a lot of uniformity of expectations. Get employee handbooks that clearly lay out what is expected of you, what you are responsible for. Another example is that American flag in every public school classroom across the country, and kind of that regular practice of standing up and pledging allegiance to the flag before you start your school day. And this teaches us, of course, citizenship and national pride. Another example is, for instance, the particular emphasis of schools. So some schools, put a lot of emphasis on their academic excellence. Some specialize in promoting like the arts. Some really put a strong emphasis on sports. So depending on what emphasis your school has, also depends on the funding that is going to these programs. And children, depending on what school they're in and what they excel in, can develop feelings of inclusion or exclusion based on that school's emphasis. and that can develop based on whether or not the student excels in the school's favored programs. So if your school is well known for its baseball team, and you go to school there, but you really are not good at baseball, you're really good at math, but the school doesn't really accentuate or emphasize kind of excellence in mathematics, it emphasizes more excellence in baseball. That can, even though that child's very talented in one particular field, if they're not necessarily successful in the emphasis of the school, like baseball, it can result in feelings of exclusion or inferiority, even though that child is very talented in many other ways. And another example, last one, of the hidden curriculum is the physical condition of the school. Are the classrooms, desks, textbooks, walls, roofs in good shape, or are they damaged? Does the ceiling leak every time that it rains over the school? So if your school's not in great condition, students might start to internalize feelings of resentment or feelings of a lack of value, because they might start to internalize these kind of uncared for surroundings and environments as indicating that they are not cared for as well. So those are just a few examples of kind of that hidden curriculum and the way that school can socialize us, not just by teaching us what's on the pages of the textbook, but in many other aspects of our social lives. So the second institutional agent we're going to look at is the workplace. So socialization into the workplace is another key aspect of our socialization into becoming well-rounded members of society. So workplace socialization is that process by which employees come to understand the company's policies, the internal culture, how the company hierarchy works, and the ways to function effectively in that organization. So interpersonal skills are very important in the workplace. You need to develop skills like empathy, cooperation, clear communication, listening, and exhibiting appropriate nonverbal communication, body language, appropriate eye contact, and facial expressions. So we talked about material versus non-material culture in Chapter 3. So in the workplace, you also have to kind of learn these new aspects of culture. You have to learn the material culture of the office. Where's the office? Where's your cubicle? Where's the employee restroom? Are there rules to using the employee restroom? Are there time limits for how long you can take a break? Where's the HR office, the boss's office, the break room? But at the same time, you have to learn a lot about the non-material culture, and sometimes this can be even more important in the workplace. So you learn how to share the coffee machine according to kind of the norms of the office. Like, do they take turns making coffee each day? Does one person make the coffee and someone else clean it out at the end of the day? Who restocks it for everyone else? Another example is how and when to speak with the boss. Does he prefer emails? Does he let you just walk into his office whenever you need to talk about something? Do you need to give him 15 minutes heads up? Do you need to give him 7 days heads up? Another example is how and when to speak with coworkers. Learning the chain of command, who to go to with certain issues, who approves projects, and who is above your boss, if anyone. And knowing what is and is not appropriate to talk about at the water cooler. Now, the third example of institutional agents of socialization We talked about the school, talked about the workplace. The government is also a crucial agent in socializing us into certain categories, usually based on our age. So our government defines rites of passage into new social categories and age norms. So when are you considered an adult or legally responsible? At what age can you drive, vote, smoke, drink alcohol, register for military service? And how old must you be to get married? At what age are you expected to pay taxes or pay for your own health care? And when are you considered to be of old age and eligible for senior benefits? So political socialization is part of this government institutional socialization. And this is the process whereby people develop the attitudes, values, beliefs, opinions, and behaviors that are conducive to becoming good citizens in the country. So young people, of course, from an early age, we even talked about the hidden curriculum of the school and pledging to allegiance every morning. And this instills certain beliefs and behaviors in us to respect our country and our fellow citizens and the law and our history. So young people are socialized to respect authorities such as the president, teachers, police officers, and firefighters, and they are taught the importance of obeying laws from a young age. Now, the fourth institutional agent we'll look at is the mass media. So the mass media, it's a distribution of impersonal information directed at a wide audience. And this can be via the internet, newspapers, magazines, comic books, radio, video games, music, movies, and television, or any way that you can ingest mass media. So media helps direct what roles we admire and the celebrities that we might want to emulate, and also encourages viewers to buy products via advertising. Mass media has a pretty great influence over our social norms and scripts and promotion of societal values, norms, and beliefs. For instance, children 8 to 12 years old, the average time spent using screen media every day is 4.5 hours. And media can socialize us both by what it shows us, but also by what it conceals. So for instance, if you think about the TV shows or movies that you watch, what races or ethnicities are represented on the television shows or movies that we watch? How are men and women represented in what we're watching? What ideals of beauty, femininity, are promoted, or what ideals of appeal and masculinity are promoted? Are LGBTQ individuals represented? And how prevalent is violence or sex in the media that you consume? So much of our media, I'm sure you all can attest to, it's saturated with sex and violence. Sex and violence sells. So violence in the media, it's long been blamed for a lot of heinous crimes, particularly starting back in the 90s with the Columbine shooting, when it was claimed that the shooters played violent video games and listened to the music of Marilyn Manson, and it was claimed that kind of being exposed to this media is what led them to the school shooting at Columbine. And this raises the question of whether our media molds and shapes us and its image, or if the media just represents the dominant zeitgeist or kind of philosophy that's already present in the society. So are we violent because we watch violence on TV, or is there violence on TV because we're already a violent society and it's just mirroring what we are back to us? So there's still a debate amongst researchers on this question. People have been going back and forth for many years, and some have concluded that there are correlations between violent media and violent actions, but media is only one of many contributing factors. So it's not as if you watch one violent TV show and you're going to go out and hurt someone, but it could be a contributing factor. Say you grew up in poverty, or maybe a child was abused themselves from a young age, and then they also watch a lot of violent media. Maybe several other contributing factors have happened in their life to make them make more violent decisions. And so media, it's not a direct causation of violence, but a lot of studies have found that, yes, it can be one factor, but it's definitely not the primary or only thing leading to violent actions. So if you think back to chapter 2 when we were talking about the different research methods, and remember that research method called secondary data analysis, and that's when you, or a researcher, sociologist, looks at something that's already been published or already been put out into kind of the social world, and then they analyze that piece of art or material, often in a different way than might have been originally intended when the piece was written or produced. So I have an example on this slide of a recent publication in the sociological journal Crime, Media, Culture from February of this year, and it was written by sociologist Liam Kennedy, and it is an article. It's called "Whenever There's Trouble, Just Yelp for Help: Crime, Conservation, and Corporatization in Paw Patrol." So cartoons and like any media can also help to socialize children in developing their sense of right and wrong and other aspects of socialization. And children's television programming is often critiqued for the kind of overt and implied messages that shows communicate to kids. So in this article by Liam Kennedy, he specifically is criticizing Paw Patrol, and he concludes that Paw Patrol is echoing core tenets of corporate privatization, promoting a distrust in public authorities, and encourages complicity in a global capitalist system that reproduces inequalities and causes environmental harms. So in particular, he's looking at Paw Patrol and claiming that it encourages kids to embrace kind of privatization and capitalism. And he argues that because of the way that law enforcement and government workers are portrayed in the show, like the mayor is supposed to be very incompetent, and there are other government officials who are portrayed as unethical and corrupt, and the Paw Patrol is kind of a private corporation that steps in for kind of this incompetent government or state and provides basic social services like law enforcement, firefighting, recycling, because the government can't do its job. So Liam Kennedy here says that the show accentuates the power of the individual at the expense of the need of society to make structural changes, and the necessity of the government to take care of their citizens. Now, this is definitely an example of secondary data analysis. The producers or writers of Paw Patrol probably didn't have that in mind when they were writing and producing this show. But sociologists often try to look at things from a different perspective and look at kind of the underlying messages that are being communicated to children via cartoons and media like this. There's also a link on here to another article which criticizes Paw Patrol and Thomas the Train Engine, saying that one says that Thomas the Train Engine takes place in a, quote, pre-modern corporate totalitarian dystopia and exhibits classist, sexist, and anti-environmentalist kind of messages to children. So when we think about children and media and socialization, it's also important to keep in mind some statistics. So going to the kind of positivist end of things here. So we'll start with this middle graphic where it says kids ages 2 to 11 see an average of 25,600 advertisements a year. And then in the pink bubble there, it says more than 40% of their ad exposure came from non-children shows. Then if we look over at the graphic on the left here, where it says exposure to TV ads, up here, TV is still the #1 place where kids spend their media time. And it says ages 2 to 8 years old watch about 1 hour a day of TV. And children that are 8 years and older watch at least 2.5 hours a day. Now, what kind of ads are children seeing? Mostly ads for fast food, candy, and cereal. And those accounted for almost half of the ads seen by kids. There's also this statistic down here, 85% of companies that market food to kids had websites with content for children, like viral marketing, online TV ads, and branded items for download. Then we'll look over to this graphic on the right, where it says cross promotions and online advertising. So cross promotions, there have been an increase in promotions tying food and drink products to movies, cartoon characters, toys, video games, websites, theme parks, and other entertainment venues. So you can see that growth in cross promotions from 2006 to 2009 there. Kids 8 and older spend 1.5 hours a day using a computer for fun at home, where they're also exposed to ads. So it's not just on TV anymore. We also are advertised to on our phones and our computers. So 87% of the most popular children's websites carry some type of advertising. 3 billion display ads for food and beverages were viewed on kid-aimed websites from 2009 to 2010, and 1/3 of those have premium offers in exchange for a product purchase. Now we will look at our final agent of socialization, religion. So religion teaches participants how to interact with its material culture. Depending on what religion you are, you learn how to interact with the altar, how to kneel on it. You interact with the mezuzah in the Jewish faith, the confessional or the communion wafer in the Catholic faith, or the prayer rug in the Muslim faith. So religion teaches believers what is right and wrong, and that goes even beyond, or maybe even supersedes, notions of right and wrong that are taught to us by, say, the government institutional agent. So some religions promote individualism, while others promote a more communitarian ethos. Some religions display very little hierarchical organization, while others have very complex hierarchies, like the Catholic Church. Religion also socializes us and teaches us how to regulate ceremonies related to family structure or major life and death events, such as marriage, baptism, and funerals. And believers in religion, they learn songs, they learn prayers, and perform dances. Many religions also socialize people to uphold gender norms. For example, the idea that women should obey their husbands is taught in a lot of religions, or that women cause the quote-unquote original sin in Christianity with Eve eating the apple. Many religious sects do not allow women to preach or have any place in the hierarchy of authority. Now, we have covered pretty broad introduction to socialization, talked about the different kind of theoretical viewpoints and stages of development, and talked about all those agents of socialization, both our family and the peers, but also all those institutional agents as well. And all of those agents kind of in combination, and all the different socialization that we're receiving through all of these agents kind of prepares us to be the best individuals, the best participants in our society that we can be. So this slide, we are going to start looking at resocialization. So this is a process by which old behaviors that we were socialized into and that were helpful in a previous role, they're removed because they no longer apply to our current role. And resocialization can be very stressful for individuals because people have to unlearn behaviors that have become customary to them. So over here with my Yoda quote, you must unlearn what you have learned. And resocialization, it's most common in a total institution. And that's a place where people are isolated from the original society that they were a part of and coerced to follow a new set of rules. So we most often see resocialization in prisons or a convent or monastery or a cult. You also see it in the military, because when you join the military, you kind of have to break down this identity of being an individual and learn to kind of think of yourself as like this unit, as part of this unit and this team. So for instance, resocialization is necessary when a person moves to a senior care center or a boarding school or goes to jail. It's a place where the old rules that you were used to no longer apply. And there's a two-step process to resocialization. So first comes the degradation ceremony. So degradation meaning, kind of tearing something down. So during the degradation ceremony, the person must leave behind their old identity in order to take on the role of their new identity, whether that be the identity of someone who's in prison, a prisoner, going from a free person to a confined, very regimented space, or going from being a high school student to joining the military, take on a whole array of new responsibilities in that new role. And these new roles and responsibilities can really change your identity, even the way you view yourself. And during the degradation ceremony, a lot of symbolic actions take place, such as giving away your personal belongings, or cutting your hair, or losing and giving up some of your rights and freedoms. And it's only after that process, that degradation of your previous identity, that you can move to the second step of building up your new identity in line with that new society and the new role that you've taken on. So I think one really stark example of the degradation ceremony is when we look at kind of new recruits into the armed forces, and especially during their first day and their first week, joining up with that new identity. And on this slide, there's a link to a short, I think it's 15-minute video that kind of illustrates day one of Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. And you can see in the video that there is, the second that they even get on the bus headed to boot camp, their new role and their new identity starts to be instilled in them. And kind of that focus of the first day and the first week is to really break down any identity and role that the individuals there had prior to coming to boot camp. They need to kind of break down that identity in order to build up this new identity of being a member of the armed forces. So one quote that I picked out from this video was one of the drill sergeants, and she said, "We need to break down these individualities that they come with, of self and me and I. We need to break them down to basically nothing so we can build them back up, not as one, but as one team." And so especially during this video, you'll see like very high stress environment being created. The personal belongings are taken away from all of the participants. Everything is done very quickly with a lot of speed, no patience, no room for error. There's a lot of shouting and commands by the drill sergeants, and it kind of instills this new reality and this new identity that these individuals are about to take on in order to be the best Marine that they can be. And that is the end of this week's Chapter 5 lecture on socialization and resocialization.